Hi, my name is Mathew Gnagy. I've been designing and making sweaters for 15 years, and in 2011, Interweave published my book, Knitting Off the Axis. From my earliest days as a knitter, I've been fascinated by unique sweater construction, bias knitting, entrelac, double face, and especially sideways knitting. In this workshop, Sideways Knits, I'll discuss some of the sweaters from Knitting Off the Axis. You'll learn about pattern placement, internal shaping, and some possible complications you'll meet along the way. Some how-to demos will include the pocket opening on the Eric, which we can see right here. This is the Eric cardigan. And some short row cabling in the neckline of the Jose cardigan. We'll be looking at this area right here. Then, I'll introduce you to Jessie. This is a comfortable semi-fitted sweater with a classic silhouette and is also a classic example of what a truly sideways sweater can be. We'll take a look at a few of the techniques in the Jessie sweater, and I'll get you started on making one for yourself. The pattern for Jessie is included with this video, and once you've started it, you'll want to keep on knitting. So let's move into taking a look at a number of sweaters from Knitting Off the Axis and learning why you want to knit sideways. So one of the questions that I get most of the time when talking about knitting off the axis is, why would I want to knit sideways? What's special about knitting sideways? Well, there are several things that I find really interesting about knitting sideways. The first and most basic one is that it's not really done as frequently as I think it should be. So I like making sweaters sideways and putting patterns in interesting places, turning cables on their sides. There's a lot of small reasons that when you add it all together makes for really interesting clothing. So now let's talk for just a moment about pattern placement and what it does to make a garment look really interesting. I have two examples of almost exactly the same pattern in front of me right here. We'll start with the original design. This one was knit straight up and down, and you can see that, it's a nice batwing sweater, but for the most part it's a fairly, I hate saying this, but it's a fairly ho-hum design. But as I was assembling the garment, I took it and accidentally flopped it down on the table sideways and saw this fantastic silhouette right here with this cable going up the arm, and this becomes a sleeve seam, and the whole thing just took on a much more interesting silhouette and I think a much more interesting knit. So I immediately set about rewriting the pattern and working up another sample, and this is what I ended up with. So you can see that here's the original center front of this sweater, but now we've got it going up the arm. Here's that side seam that I pointed out. We've enlarged this area just a little bit so that it swings a little bit better on the waist, and added a nice collar. Now the only real change that I made to this pattern was the size of the waist, and we actually put in a deeper shaped neckline. But other than that, simply turning this garment on its side took it from being a ho-hum garment to something with wow. Another great aspect of knitting sideways is internal shaping and how it affects the hang of garment. We can take a regular flat piece of fabric, and when you're knitting sideways, the simple addition of increases or decreases can give you bust shaping and waist shaping, and can really take a relatively flat piece of fabric that we would normally knit with a traditional sweater and turn it into something that really fits in an interesting way. Here's a good example of what I'm talking about. Now this garment actually has bust darts knit right into it. I've got it laid out so that we're looking at the side seam right here, and here's the sleeve opening. So this is our cast on edge, and immediately after we cast on, we begin doing some increases right here in the middle of the work. And this curves this entire piece, and then at one point here, we stop doing those increases and just start to work straight, which turns the garment. It gives a really great three-dimensional shape right here. We've also added some hem shaping, which is just as simple as doing an increase along the hem of the garment. Now we've put the increase to the inside of this cable so that the cable is following the edge as a piece of trim, and it looks really attractive. But if we were knitting this garment from bottom to top, we would have to do that entire waist or hem shaping with short rows, which is something that is a little bit more complicated and not always as easy to look at. So this makes it real simple and real beautiful and very easy to replicate when you go across the other side. It's just a much more simple technique. Now also, you'll notice these panels right here. Now this is a double garter, which is 2 rows of stockinette and 2 rows of reverse stockinette countered against each other, and essentially it's the horizontal version of 2x2 rib. And we put those panels here at the sides to draw this in a little bit more and give even more shaping. Now we could do this on a straight up and down knit with 2x2 ribbing, but the beauty of this double garter is that it has a little bit more strength than a 2x2 rib, which would have a tendency to stretch out a little bit more, and this one likes to pull back a little stronger, so it gives better shaping along the sides. Something to think about when you're knitting a garment sideways, one of the more difficult parts of knitting a garment sideways is the change in the direction of the stretch of the fabric. When we're knitting from the bottom to the top or the top down, our fabric has the majority of stretch going across the body and around. And when you're knitting sideways, that stretch is going up and down the body, so gravity has a tendency to pull against it a lot more. Now, if you're making a garment that's large and heavy, you can actually use that to your advantage, knowing that gravity is going to pull the garment down through wear. It will, as a garment gets stretched longer, it will also consequently get narrower. So using that geometry of knitting to your advantage when you're designing a garment is also really helpful. Something that people frequently ask me is knitting sideways hard? And my response is, well, no, it's just knitting. It doesn't matter what you're doing, you're just going a different direction, but the actual process of knitting doesn't change. It still knits and purls and increases and decreases. You're just having to think from a slightly different direction when you're looking at a chart or anticipating what a design is going to do when it's going across the fabric.